In this video, we're going to take our xpExplosiaFX fire simulation and create a newer, higher resolution look. So let's get started. So here we are in a new blank scene, and what we're going to do is open our original burn number 5 file. So let's go to File, Open, and we'll go to our MoGraph countdown, 5 burn. And let's just open the last version that we had of that. So just to be organized, what we're going to do is save this as a brand new file in a brand new folder. So let's just go to File, Save As. We'll go up one. Let's create a new folder and we'll call it XP Countdown 5 burn. Let's just call it HQ for high quality, and I'll just copy that name. So let's put it in the cache folder whilst we're there. Excellent. And we'll paste in that name and give it version. There we go. All right. So what we have here is our original with our cloth tearing, and this obviously has our xpExplosiaFX sim, which has been used for 2 things. It's been used, it's very important that we keep this, it's been used to advect that cloth, but it's also, we were going to be using it for rendering, but the rendering is fine for draft, but it's not particularly detailed. So how do we take this and make a new one so all of the advection remains the same, but we get a bit more of a detailed xpExplosiaFX simulation? Well, what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to pump lots more particles into the scene, which are fuel emitters. We need those particles to have a smaller radius than our original cloth particles that made this sim, and we also need to reduce, in our xpExplosiaFX, reduce this voxel size so it's more detailed. So this is what we're going to do. We are going to take our initial cloth emitter particles. We're not going to change these because these need to remain the same for our cloth sim, but we are going to spawn from these particles new particles in the same position, and it's those spawned particles which will become our new emitter. So this is what we're going to do. In our emitter, these are our cloth emitter. Let's just go to the cache tag and disable the cache. Okay, good. So that's looking good. Now what we want to do is we want to run another simulation and have these spawning. So let's go to, we need to do a few things. Let's go to our modifiers and let's bring in a spawn. So we'll go to Generate and we want Spawn. Now this is going to be what's creating our new particles. So let's add a spawning emitter and let's rename that emitter. Let's call that, actually we'll leave the emitter on because that makes sense. Let's call it emitter spawn. Very nice. And in our spawn settings, what do we want to do? Let's go to our object tab. So we want the spawn particle position to be the source particle, yes, and we'll leave it as it is for now. We want the spawned particle speed to be absolute. That means it's going to take its speed from the actual emitter itself. So let's go in there, emission tab, and we want no speed because we want it to be advected by our xpExplosiaFX. Now also in here, we have our infectio, and this is what's infecting our particles, which is giving them the fuel value, which is making the fire creep over our original particles. So we obviously want that to be live, but we don't want the infectio to affect our new particles because it's going to mess up the simulation. We don't need that. So let's go to our the new emitter spawn emitter. Let's go to the modifiers tab and we'll exclude the infectio. Okay, very nice. So what else do we want to do? Well, in the physical modifier, now this originally was giving our emitter its fuel value, but we don't actually need to do that anymore for this emitter because our xpExplosiaFX is already cached, so we don't need to redo that. So it doesn't matter if this emitter has fuel or not. But we want to give our new emitter fuel. So let's go to that physical modifier, and we just leave it as it is. But remember, if we go to the groups affected, we set it up so it only affected our infected and incubated particles. That's no longer relevant. So let's just delete those. So it'll affect all particles. So our emitter spawn will get those fuel values, which is what we want. Okay. Very good. So in our emitter spawn, let's just change the display to a color that's going to be really obvious. So we'll make these, we haven't done blue yet, we'll make these blue particles. And a couple more steps before we simulate. Let's go to our spawn. So we set this up, look, we're spawning 300 particles per second from every source particle. So that's a lot. Let's put that down to say 10 per frame. Spawn particle life is absolute, which means it's going to get the particle life from the emitter. So by default, it's going to be set to full lifespan, but we could just put that down to say 10. We don't need them to be alive the whole time. All right, back to the spawn mod. And we could put spawn once only. We only need it to spawn a particle once, so that's fine. All right, so now if we hit play, let's see what happens. All right, so we've got loads of blue particles all over our cloth. So it's kind of working, but we don't want them to be all over the cloth. We only want them to be where they have become infected. We want these blue particles to spread up like they did before. So look, what we need to do is go to the spawn mod, go to the groups affected and drag in the incubated and the infected. Let's have a look. So now we're getting them spawning on. That's great. So look what we could do. We don't need to see our original xpExplosiaFX. So here we go. We've got our spreading particles making their way on, dying off. And that's looking good. Let's just make those a little bit bigger in the viewport. So we'll go to the display tab. Let's just make it squares. Let's have a look. There we go. Very nice. So that's looking good. So what's happening is that even though these particles have no speed, they're being advected by our xpExplosiaFX. And you know what? To speed this up, actually, we don't even need to be running our cloth FX sim. In fact, this is already cached. So what we could do is let's just make that invisible. And let's switch off the cloth modifier. So nothing is happening with that cloth now. But because our advection is remaining the same, it will follow the same shape. But look how much more quickly that runs. That's looking good. So I think that they're dying off a little bit too quickly. Let's go to our emitter spawn. Remember, we set this lifespan to be 10 frames. I don't think that's long enough. Let's put 15 with a 5-frame variation. So then they're just going to linger around a little bit more. Let's have a look. There we go. And they're hitting the geometry. They're making their way up. That's all looking very nice. Okay. Good. And remember, we wanted to reduce the size of these. Let's put it down to 1.5, the radius of our new particles. Excellent. So all we have done, let's just recap. We have taken our original simulation for our fire, and there was lots going on in that simulation. There was a cloth FX solve. That cloth FX was creating particles in this emitter. We were then infecting those particles to put them into different groups, which spread up the cloth. And then we were using those as our emitter to create our original xpExplosiaFX simulation. Now, the advection from that original xpExplosiaFX simulation is fine, and that's what we're using to move our spawned particles. So we still want this xpExplosiaFX lower res cached one for the advection. But now we have got these spawned particles, what we want to do is use these particles to create a new higher resolution exposure effects sim, which we're going to use for rendering. So the quickest way of getting this to work as we want it is to cache these particles out again. So let's create a new cache object. So we'll go to Other Objects, we'll go to xpCache, and let's click on that. And this new cache object, all we want to do is cache our new emitter spawn particles. So to do that, we go to the Inclusion tab, and let's change this mode from exclude to include, and now only the objects dropped in here will be cached. So let's drag in our emitter spawn. So now only these particles are going to get cached. Let's go back to the Object tab, and let's give it a path. And of course, we want to go to our libraries, MoGraph Countdown, 5BurnHQ, cache, hit OK. Fantastic. And let's just have one last playthrough to make sure that everything's as we want it. So there are our new... so one thing before we cache is if we put these emitter spawn particles back down to the dot display mode, there you go, dots, you'll see that we've got lots of particles in the scene, but it doesn't look like many because all those 10 spawns per particle are being spawned on top of each other. We want to spread this out. So we can do that by giving them a positional offset. Let's go to our spawn mod, go to the Object tab, and we have an offset value here. So let's go to 2 centimeters offset, go forward a few frames. So now look, it's spread out a little bit, and we could even maybe go 3 centimeters offset. All right, and that's giving us a wider spread of our new smaller particles. Fantastic. That's looking good. Excellent. Right, so let's go to our new cache object, and we're going to build cache. And it shouldn't take too long because there's not an awful lot going on here. So what I'll do anyway, I'll pause it, come back when it's finished, and we'll have a look at what our results are. Okay, so that was a very quick cache. So here we have our new particles, and we've got lots more of them, and they are smaller. So fantastic. So now what we're able to do is really completely come out of this scene and build a much less complicated one. So what I've done, let's just save this, and we will then go to File, New. Let's go to Window. We'll go back to that one that we just had, and let's borrow some elements from here then. So what do we want? We want to take our new cache, and we want to take our emitter spawn. So before we copy these across, let's remember we'll go to the cache tag on the emitter spawn. Let's put copy tag data. So we'll hit that. We'll hit Control and bring in the cache object as well. And do you know what? Let's bring in our xpExplosiaFX object because it's the right dimensions, and then we'll kind of zero these out. So let's hit Control C. We'll go to our new file, and we'll hit Control V. Excellent. In our xpExplosiaFX, let's delete this cache tag that we don't need. And let's do a couple of things in our xpExplosiaFX. This is our brand new scene, and we've got our particles. So with this scene in the xpExplosiaFX, we want to reduce the voxel size down so it's more detailed. Let's try 1, for example. And also, let's go to our advection, and I mean, our particles are cached, so this doesn't really matter, but let's just do it. We did deselect the advect particles because we don't need to advect anything. We're just making a sim. Very nice. All right. So let's save this file out before we start caching anything. Let's go to File, and we'll go Save As, and let's look. The last file I saved for my high quality one is version 2. So what I'm going to say is click on this and then change the 2 to a 3. And now my newest version just contains this information, which is our particles. All right. So now what we can do is start simming. So we have our emitter spawn that's cached. Let's put an X-Particles source, xpExplosiaFX source on it. Let's hit play, and we're getting a sim. And the reason we're getting a sim is that we have cached these particles, but we cached them with a fuel value, and the fuel value, let's pop back to our previous scene, the fuel value was given to them by the physical modifier. So they have a fuel value, and now we have got this sim running in our viewport. So let's just make the particles invisible. So now we have a much higher resolution fire simulation moving at the same speed as our previous sim. All right, so that's looking pretty nice. So let's just bring this through. So just to make sure that we're getting the correct movement, let's bring in our cloth. So we'll go to Window, back to our previous file, and let's have a look. What do we need to take? So we need to take our cache object, because this is what's holding the information for our cloth cache. Let's make sure that we've got copy tag data, and we'll select our cloth, and we'll also hit Control and select the other cache object, hit Control C. Let's move back to our high quality version 3 file, paste those in, make them visible. All right, so let's have a look. Let's just take that subdivision surface off. So here we go. So our new high resolution fire sim is moving in the same way as our previous one. We've got a little bit of kind of straggling cloth here, but remember we have our Poly FX tool to be able to effectively mask this off when it comes to render time. So we're going to be getting rid of some of this cloth, but you can see it's moving in the correct way. Fantastic. So let's just, we'll just make that invisible for now. Okay, good. Right, so what we could do to have a look at this now is get some rendering set up. So just to make sure that everything's okay. So we'll go to Cycles 4D Real-Time Preview. Let's bring that on. And obviously we're not seeing anything because we have no lights in the scene. So let's create a Cycles 4D volume material, because obviously xpExplosiaFX makes volumes, and we'll just put this standard xpExplosiaFX fire and smoke material on for now, and we'll just drop that onto our xpExplosiaFX object, and there we've got some fire. And straight away you can see we have a much, much higher resolution, much nicer looking fire sim. That's looking great. And obviously once that's cached, we can make tweaks and make this look nicer. But we can see immediately that we're getting a way, way better look here. Fantastic. Let's just disable this cache so we're not playing through that. And we'll just let this go through a few more frames. We'll check one of the later on frames to see how it's looking in the render, but I'm pretty sure this is going to be looking good for us. And we're going to be able to get this cached out. And then once we have cached it, we can bring this new cache, which is just going to be the xpExplosiaFX, into our existing scene, which is set up for render. And we can get some really nice detailed looking smoke and fire. So let's go to Cycles 4D Real-Time Preview. Yeah, so this is looking really nice. This is the smoke behind it. Really nice, high detailed fire. And we are in a much better place. Fantastic. Okay, so let's get finished up then. So what we need to do is we need to go back to our original cache object. Let's go to the inclusion. So remember, we only included the spawn originally. We don't need to recache now. We just want to include our xpExplosiaFX. So we can, in fact, let's just make sure that we've got enough frames to burn out all of this fire and smoke. So we're going to put 150 frames on the timeline, and let's, in our emitter spawn, in our cache tag, let's just put override hold. And then in our cache, let's go to object, build cache, continue, and that should be fine. Okay, so we'll leave that going. I'll hit pause and come back to you when it's finished, and we'll have a look at the result. Okay, so that was a 20-minute sim, and I actually stopped it simming at frame 120. So I'm just going to put that down to 120. We're not going to need that many, but it's just to be safe, to have a little bit of wiggle room for smoke to dissipate and for us to fade it out if necessary in the comp. So that's looking pretty good. Let's just, we don't actually need our cloth surface in this scene. Let's get rid of that cache object as well, and there. And we actually don't really need these spawned particles either. Right, so now we just have our new xpExplosiaFX simulation, which is way higher resolution. So let's just have a go at rendering that and see what it looks like. So this one, it's taken a little bit longer to get through and to give us a preview because this entire cache was about 20 gig. So obviously it's a lot bigger. So let's just go to Cycles 4D, real-time preview, and let's just do a quick render of that and see what we get. So look, way more detailed render of this. Let's just go back a frame. So look at this. Now we have lots of detail in this simulation, and it's looking really cool. And that's a bit more like it. And obviously we'll make some tweaks to this material, but you can see we've got loads more detail in there. So that's looking much better for our scene. So look, let's do an incremental save on that. And now what we're going to be able to do is introduce this new xpExplosiaFX sim into our existing combined scene, and we'll be rendering this one and not rendering the one that we were using for particle advection. Okay, so we'll explore putting this into the next combined scene in the next video and start the rendering process of getting that ready for the comping stage.